The European Council agreed to open negotiations on Ukraine's accession to the EU. Finally. Good afternoon, this is Henry Keane on UATV English giving you some hard truth in easy terms for the whole free world directly from Ukraine as usual. We waited for this for years, but the waiting became excruciating during the last few months. Of course, there is too much work ahead, but this step in EU-Ukraine relations is more than just important. The positive decision of the European Council is a significant victory for Ukraine. Our government officials, diplomats, parliamentarians and the civil society have worked hard for this. Despite the opinion of skeptics and opponents of Ukrainian European integration, the EU has demonstrated its unity and effectiveness. And I must say that this is a victory not only for Ukraine but for the whole Europe, believe it or not. Accession negotiations are the penultimate step towards EU membership. Ukraine's further European integration path is moving from the political to the technical plane now. We expect the EC to approve the negotiating framework as early as March 2024. The decision of the European Council motivates, inspires Ukraine, gives it strength and faith in the future, which is especially needed today to continue the fight against the Russian invasion.
I am grateful to everyone in Ukraine, our team, who did everything necessary. We have fulfilled the recommendation of the European Commission. We have dispelled doubts. Today, there is a decision to open negotiation on accession to the EU. This step will be followed by the next ones. This is a massive job to integrate the state of the institution, of the norms, all of it into the European Union. But we will do it. Ukraine has repeatedly proved what we are capable of. There will be another victorious decision. The time will come when we will be able to celebrate Ukraine's accession to the EU.
Ukraine became the locomotive of European integration in the region, no less. The decision to open negotiations on accession to the EU was also adopted regarding Moldova. Georgia was granted the status of a candidate. Only 10 years ago, Georgia was so out of reach ahead on their path to the EU that Ukrainians were somewhat jealous of them. But now, after years of our reforms and decisive steps, we negotiate on technical details while Georgia is only the candidate. But don't get me wrong on this. It's not arrogance or pride or anything. It is nothing but an example how Russia can influence some countries, and that is exactly what Russia is doing. With some pressure on Georgian authorities, they slowed down the path to Tbilisi to EU accession. We all know too well, sometimes if we are too slow, you just lose. And that is in regard to not only about policy, but also about the war and our sovereignty in Ukraine. Russian dictator Comrade Putin spoke at the annual press conference results of the year. Last year, he didn't want actually to speak with Russians and journalists, and I'm sure that this year he could have made the same decision, but upcoming elections and rumors about his death left him with no choice. See? Even dictators happen not to have one sometimes. Of course, Putin used the straight line, well, a Russian version of straightness it is, to repeat all statements of Russian propaganda, add his lies and intimidation, so all good, all stable and quite concrete. The dictator put the most effort into imitating the normality of the terrible state to which he brought Russia by the war against Ukraine. With assurances of strengthening the sovereignty of the Russian Federation, Putin tried to conceal the expansion of the range of areas of international isolation of Russia. Justifying his sick ill intention to continue the armed aggression in Ukraine, he once again lied about the reasons for the war with Ukraine, inventing Russia's historical lands in Ukraine and the threat from NATO and the world, of course. The dictator again intimidated the audience with NATO and the lack of strict rules in the world order, and that clearly testified to his intention to continue to wage an aggressive war in Ukraine and in the world if the chance is given.
Stop living in illusions. Stop believing that there is any other solution than Russia's defeat. Stop encouraging the cannibal with your doubts and feeding him with hopes that democracies are not ready to resist and therefore he'll be able to wait it out, to force it through, not to lose and to nail down a deal. Mikhailo Podolyak, advisor to the head of the Office of the President of Ukraine on social network X, formerly Twitter.
By the way, this whole straight Russian line is just an imitation of democracy, nothing else. It seems that journalists could ask any questions to Putin until you remind yourself what actually happens and what they're doing with them in Russia, with those who dared to ask these questions and with the opposition, with mass media. All, even neutral journalists, either were killed or have already left the country or have been arrested and intimidated. But the Kremlin needs to imitate freedom of speech anyway. So Comrade Putin introduced the concept of the foreign agent, thus an enemy, that is a person or a mass media which is financed from abroad. Yeah, a Russian way of democracy. Label anyone an enemy and they'll kill them later. And you even can ask a sharp question, but as Moscow Times report, all of them are censored by Kremlin PRs. So like anyone can ask anything, but no one can ask nothing. And Putin can also answer only those questions he wants to answer, so he will feel free to lie as usual on important topics like about the Russian growing economy. Well, growing down is also growing, right? Such a growth that you have to limit the purchase of, eggs. Such a growth that there are not enough of usual vaccines in Russia. Such a growth that they lose more than 5 trillion in taxes, of dollars or otherwise. In October, Russia earned almost 15 billion from the sale of oil, and then it turned out that almost $5 billion simply disappeared in thin air, and the reports must be corrected. Russians have always been damn good when it comes to correcting reports or constitutions. So they also correct the questions for Putin, and they correct their losses in war against Ukraine and correct all the information due to their own need, correct it in Russian way, meaning lies. But reality inevitably heeds back. Usually Russians already start to feel the difference between the reality and TV widespread propaganda. Soon the Kremlin will feel it too. 2 years ago, on December 17th, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Russian Federation published the so-called draft agreements on security guarantees of the Russian Federation with the United States and NATO. It was another step in Moscow's provocative blackmail campaign of a major war. Russia reinforced the claims by deploying a strike group on the borders with Ukraine and in the temporarily occupied territories. The Kremlin's proposals to the United States and NATO were completely unrealistic and directly violated the sovereignty of many countries and everyone, including Putin, clearly understanding that.
This year, we didn't make any mistakes, not a single one. Europe went through this year with dignity, and there was no cowardice, no indecision. And Putin gained nothing over the year. Neither in the battles against Ukraine, nothing, nor in the attempts to divide and demean Europeans. And he lost everything this year. It's crucial that he lost not just in Ukraine, but in every aspect of European life. Europe maintained its unity, and Europe didn't let its people get dragged into any of the crises the Kremlin always dreams of.
2 years ago, Russia demanded from NATO to deny security guarantees to 14 member countries and an embargo on the alliance's expansion. In 2 months after that, Russia began full-scale invasion in Ukraine, and no one is sure Russia won't start new expansion, especially on NATO soil these days, especially in the case of a ceasefire on the current Ukrainian front line. Any sort of any agreement on freezing the war in Ukraine will give a respite to Putin's army and an opportunity for another expansion in Ukraine or elsewhere in the world, because Russia is Russia. You see, it never adheres to any treaties if they are not beneficial to the imperial ambitions of the Kremlin. How many times have you heard from Russian authorities were forced to begin aggression, despite the fact that there were actually some agreements actually working by that time? I mean, the Minsk agreements and the Budapest Memorandum on Ukraine, by the way. Did it stop Russia? No, it didn't. This was the case during the Russian-Georgian War, in the Russian-Chechen War just as well. There were agreements, but the Kremlin spits on all of them. Since then, nothing has changed and never will. Few months before full-scale aggression, Western countries made great efforts to settle the crisis provoked by Russia diplomatically, but Moscow was not ready for any compromise. By launching a full-scale war against Ukraine, Russia has achieved exactly the opposite of what the Kremlin actually expected. NATO has grown. Finland joined NATO, strengthening the alliance's military potential in Europe. The ratification of Sweden's accession to NATO is in its final stages. Ukraine is closer to membership than ever before. What can I say? If I would have a chance to counter Putin with my best weapon, I would counter him by letting him to continue to play the emperor. So far, things have only gone south for him. It was Henry Keane on UATV English, hoping to give you the hard truth in easy enough terms on a daily wrap-up today. Please comment, please like, and please subscribe. Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. European matters a lot to us. Stay safe and tune for more very soon. Goodbye.